This is the meeting of the Growth and Natural Resources Committee. And I do first want to make a motion to continue item 2208, that is the downtown transition area amendment, to our next meeting. So that would be at the end of January, I believe January 23rd, whereas today we're going to focus on the Green Growth Toolbox and more opportunities there. So do I have a second for that motion?
Second.
All right, all in favor? Okay, that's unanimous. So we are going to move to item 2205. This is, again, continuing the conversation about green growth tools that we can explore in the city of Raleigh. So I'll turn it over to Tansy to get us started.
Yeah, thank you. So again, you had a prior overview. We have staff today that will walk through in a little greater detail some of our current programming and ordinances and short, mid, long-term opportunities. So Justin Rometta, our zoning official, is coming to the table to kick us off.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon. Just waiting for the presentation. There we go. It's a one-person show. All right. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, committee members. Justin Rometta with Planning and Development, joined today by my colleagues Zach Manor, City's Urban Forester, and Sally Hoyt from Engineering Services, as well as some other folks from Parks and Recreation and Engineering Services and Planning and Development. Here to follow up with you on the Green Growth Toolbox, specifically with the items related to native plantings and some stormwater items as well. So agenda for today, again, this is a follow-up from your last meeting, but briefly go over some zoning regulation basics that we thought might be helpful to you as you're considering any of these potential changes, and whether that's something that you see suggested further down in the presentation or something else entirely, really. And then follow that up with a brief recap of our existing regulations, and then talk about some opportunities for going forward that we've identified as well. So in general terms, when we're thinking about what makes an effective zoning regulation or regulation in general, is that we really want to be in the space that's kind of at the intersection of these three things, right? First is that it's got to be objective, meaning that it's needs to be able to be applied consistently and predictably by anyone charged with enforcing it. And when we talk about administratively applied regulations specifically, we're actually required by law that those are objective as well. The next is that it's verifiable with relative ease, right? You've got to be able to determine compliance with the rule, whether that's on a plan or a permit application or through an inspection or some combination of those three things as well. And there's also the kind of concept of ease of understanding that falls under that one as well, right? The more easily understandable a rule is by staff, by the development community, by members of the public, the more effective it tends to be. And then finally, measures of impactfulness, meaning, right, does a regulation achieve its intended result? Does it accomplish what it's meant to do at an acceptable cost, and whether that cost is directly financial or some other indirect impact on resources such as staffing. And thinking about kind of the life cycle of a regulation, generally they're going to start with an idea. That might come from staff, from you all, or from a citizen. That idea gets eventually codified through the text amendment process, and then we move into the compliance and enforcement pieces that you see on the screen, and that's really going to be probably the focus of what the discussion surrounds today. When you move into those arenas, you're really requiring a level of technical expertise that's spread around a broad range of individuals, starting with a staff person who's reviewing a permit or a plan application, a designer, engineer, architect, landscape architects who's drawing the plans, the installer, the builder, the contractor that's actually doing the work. An inspector has to go out and verify that the work's been done, and then finally, once an improvement's been made or installed, you have kind of the long-term maintenance and operation by a property owner or operator as well. So you've got all those individuals who really need to be able to understand and know what it means to be in compliance with the regulation. And that goes further into the enforcement realm as well. When we're talking about down the road, if a complaint is made, our enforcement from a zoning standpoint is complaint driven. We have 5 code enforcement officers. There's a level of expertise, obviously, that's needed there as well to determine if someone has either come out of compliance with something that had been approved before or has initiated some other violation of the code. So I hope that's helpful in thinking about some of the discussion that we'll have a little further on. But moving on to just briefly recapping what we talked about last time. I'll move through these quickly since it is information that you've seen before. But we have really 2 main planting ordinances: the city tree manual, which is focused on street trees, trees on city-owned property or city-controlled property, and then the UDO, which has a host of landscaping or planting requirements that range from neighborhood transitions between mixed-use and residential zoning districts, protective yards that might be required between incompatible uses, parking lot landscaping, some zoning frontages such as the parkway frontage that requires the 50-foot landscape buffer, and then a few other special and overlay zoning districts that have some landscaping requirements as well. The tree manual, in terms of species selection, since we're really talking about ideas for native planting requirements here, takes into account in the species that it's going to require or select for any given project, the form of that tree, its disease and pest resistance, trees that are well suited for urban conditions in terms of surviving in cramped spaces and handling urban runoff, et cetera. There is a prohibition on exotic invasives in the tree manual, so those species cannot be used for street trees today. However, there is an encouragement of species diversity. Zach can speak more to that when he comes up in a bit. And then also the requirement or allowance for smaller maturing trees under overhead power lines. Here's a list that Zach and his team maintain of possible street trees that can be used. Just of note here, it's a large list that's separated by the size of the trees. But of note, some of these are native, some are not, but they've all been selected for some characteristic and suitability of achieving what a street tree is supposed to achieve. And on the flip side, here's the list they maintain as trees that can't be used. You see on the right is the prohibited invasive species, so there's a list there and a reference provided as to anything that's invasive and can't be used. And then again, the list on the left, for whatever reason, has some characteristic that makes it not a suitable street tree. And again, some of those are native species and some are not. The UDO has some kind of separate purposes and goals aside from the tree manual, right? In addition to environmental aspirations, there are some goals of noise attenuation, things like screening and buffering between certain uses. And so with that being said, the species selection is that any vegetation that's required to be planted by the UDO has to be hardy to Zone 7 and locally adapted. Locally adapted means it's naturally found in North Carolina or adapted to our climate. So certainly not, excuse me, to the level of a native species. Basically just means it has grown here for some time and can grow here. And those are paired with size and location requirements as far as how large, in terms of diameter and height, they have to be at planting time, percentages of evergreen and deciduous, et cetera. So before we move on to some potential opportunities for changes, did just want to highlight some considerations that are also helpful to think about when if proposing any changes. One is that most of these would require a text change to the UDO and or the tree manual. And then thinking about going back to that objective and verifiable framework, just making sure there's, when we're talking about native, everyone understands what that means and that we have a resource to point to so that everyone can easily determine whether a certain species is suitable or not. Luckily, we have the NC State Plant Toolbox, and then there are some other resources out there, but just wanted to flag that if you wanted to move in that direction, that we would want to make sure there's a resource that is identified as well that we could all use. And then thinking about the potential value of non-native species as well. In terms of things like ornamentals, there are many popular varieties of non-native species that homeowners like or that are used in developments for a variety of reasons. They grow well here. They provide good screening. They're readily available. They look nice. People want them in their yards, etc. So there's that to take into consideration, and then how readily available plant material is from local nurseries. If we start restricting allowable species to a smaller and smaller number, we would just want to make sure that whatever it is we are requiring is available locally.
Quick question. Where does the crepe myrtle fall on this? Because
Certainly not a native species.
Right.
And Zach can talk more about it. That's the extent of
Sure. So a crepe myrtle would be considered locally adapted, but not native and not invasive at this point. What we are seeing recently is a new sort of pest, the crepe myrtle bark scale, which has been coming from the south and causing some significant issues with the crepe myrtle. So we've shifted it a bit to our regulated planting list as opposed to our free to use plant list, just because of those kind of concerns and changes over time.
Okay, thank you.
And then finally, just the last one on the list there is staffing resources and technical expertise that I kind of hinted at earlier, and we'll talk more about that as we go through some of the opportunities. But in sum, there is no requirement in either document that that native species be used in any given circumstance. Tree manual does have an explicit prohibition of invasives. The UDO does not. It rather requires that locally adapted species. So moving on to some opportunities, we've identified some short, medium, and long-term potential options for your discussion and consideration today. Going to actually start with the midterm horizon. I hope it makes sense why as we move through it. But those are some potential UDO text amendments that could be enacted. One pretty low-hanging fruit there is just to have that prohibition of invasive species in the UDO. And basically what that would say is you couldn't use species from an identified list to meet any planting requirement or use any existing invasive species to satisfy any planting requirement as well. Pretty straightforward, would probably have a fairly small to moderate impact on achieving the goal. The goal here would be to obviously to reduce the amount of those throughout the city, just simply because in terms of development projects, especially with trees, we don't see a lot of invasive species being planted to meet those types of requirements, but it's certainly something that could be enacted and also would have a low impact on resources as well. Would be fairly easily enforced as long as we were able to come up with some objective standards. Another potential option would be to actually require some native vegetation. And so that would be, applying some minimum percentage in of required plantings that would have to be of a native species, right? And so that would apply, it could apply to any landscaping requirement, or it could apply to certain protective yards, or some combination thereof. Nothing magical or scientific about that 25% number that we've identified to date, really just taking into account some of the things we mentioned as far as making sure we still maintain diversity and availability of material and that sort of thing. So certainly nothing scientific about that number. As far as impacts go, if this were applied to trees only, probably have a pretty moderate to high impact on both goals and resources, right? You would certainly increase the number of native species being planted throughout the city with new developments. Would also take a higher level of technical expertise from staff and all those individuals on that list that we talked about as well, right? To make sure that those are easily identified and understood by everyone. Would probably take some significant training in terms of staff, especially most planners and inspectors have some limited, horticultural knowledge, but certainly not to the level of, someone like Zach or his team might have with reviewing plans and permits. If you wanted to also apply that to shrubs, so most protective yards also require a shrubbery planting requirement as well. That's probably going to drive that impact up even higher, just because of the lifespan on shrubs is generally shorter. They're being replaced more often. You've got to make sure the owner or operator is educated on what they can replace with. There are so many varieties and cultivars of shrubs, right? You might have a native species, but there might be hundreds or even thousands of cultivars that may not be native. And so that really drives up the administrative kind of burden and impact exponentially over just requiring it for trees. Finally, just one other option, pretty straightforward, would be some incentives for retaining native trees on development sites. That could look like permitting trees that are retained of a certain species, of course, that would be healthy and of an acceptable size to count towards planting requirements, regardless of where they are on the site. Now, that comes with some trade-offs in terms of if a tree's in the middle of the site, it's obviously not going to provide screening to adjacent property owners and things of that nature. So there are trade-offs there. But this one is another low to moderate impact. Probably tough to get people to use it, a whole lot. Just because if a tree's, again, in the middle of the site, it's going to have to be removed regardless, and so it might not get a ton of uptake, but it does have some potential for impact and could be relatively easily enforced as well. And so moving backwards then to the kind of short to immediate term horizon is if council wanted to move forward with any of those changes or any other change, we could kind of draft some template zoning conditions that could be used in the interim while the actual language is going through the drafting and text amendment process. So there's an opportunity there for some very, very short-term impact that you could choose to do that we could help draft. We would just want to be careful that we provide flexibility, as obviously oftentimes things change as they go through that process, but that's something that could be done to have some short-term impact. And finally, just wanted to flag as a potential long-term option the resource management zoning district, something that I believe you've probably heard a little bit about before, but the city does have some special enabling authority to apply these resource management zoning districts that really gives some very broad authority to regulate tree plantings, tree and other vegetation plantings, when and how they can be removed and replaced, et cetera. It's a heavy lift, as it obviously would require rezoning and associated UDO text amendments. But again, it does give you that kind of finer level of control and broader authority. Whether that's something you want to discuss as part of this initiative or in the future. And it can be tied back to some strategic plan initiatives that we are finishing up or are ongoing, including the tree canopy study and the urban heat islands might be useful in terms of identifying, if not a citywide resource management district, some targeted areas that you could apply it to as well. So again, that's a long-term horizon opportunity. Obviously, a high impact on resources, but does have the highest potential kind of payoff in the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach to talk about Parks and Recreation, and then Sally, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Zach Manor, Raleigh Parks. Justin talked a lot about development and kind of private property requirements. I wanted to take a little time to talk about some of the things that Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources is doing currently in a similar sort of timeline. So looking at things we're doing now, things we could do that have a relatively medium impact with a medium lift, and then kind of going up to a longer term, bigger lift kind of piece. So we engage in significant amount of land management. So thinking about things that help encourage native trees, native plants. So the picture in the example was from a controlled burn. So we do things like fire ecology to help manage native plant populations at our parks and nature preserves, right? We restrict deer browse. So if you plant a native tree, you got to put something around it so the deer don't eat it. So we're actively working on land management. So that includes specifically invasive plant removal, whether that be through an event. We have an extensive volunteer network and a lot of folks who buy into our parks and properties to kind of work. I think some of you all partook in one of those. It's definitely not an easy morning, I guess I would say. So we appreciate the hard work because it's tough. One of the things is that all these things are connected. So if there's an invasive in your yard, chances are it'll end up in one of our properties over time. So looking at this holistically, what we can do is what we have control over currently, and that's really one of the big things we're working on. So we recently hired an invasive program coordinator, works under our land stewardship group and our Parks Natural Resources group. So that's pretty exciting. That was vacant for a bit. We continued to do events over time, so it wasn't like we stopped paying attention to invasives. But with that back in, it's a good kind of focus piece. Another thing we do is sort of habitat designations and programs. So things like Bee City USA. We're members of the Biophilic City Network. We Monarch Way Station programs, Greenway Wildflower, Sunflowers at Dick's, things like that are all sort of ways we can let the public know the benefits of native plants. And we're also making those improvements as we go. Justin mentioned the NC State Extension Plant Toolbox. That's been a great tool for us to use as well. It's easily sortable. It's a good way for us to kind of take a look and find out what works in certain situations or what doesn't, and how that can be applied sort of across the board. We've sort of identified that internally as our sort of primary resource. I believe we used it on a rezoning case not too long ago. And then the last piece is sort of we're coordinating a City of Raleigh stakeholder group for internal city projects to talk about city project development and how the use of non-invasives to be part of that. So if we're looking at a citywide, starts at home as well. So that's something that our staff are working with the putting together a group of the designers and plan implementers who work for all the departments in the city to really start this conversation internally. So this is the sort of medium impact limited lift. So talking about that internal City of Raleigh project invasive standards. Once we get this group up, we really want to hear about what's easy, what's hard, where our challenges are, where we can have success. So as we work through that process, we could eventually come up with a project invasive standard, or, as mentioned, a native tree percentage, same kind of thing, based on sort of guidance. Working on a certified pollinator and wildlife habitat program. So we do all these kind of separate planting, pollinator, wildlife things by themselves, but being a way to sort of coordinate that into one specific program to kind of provide some clarity to citizens and staff as they work through the process. And then kind of along those same lines as developing a horticultural guidance document for City of Raleigh. So I know quite a bit about trees. You get much smaller, and I'm pretty far out of my depth at that point. So this could be very beneficial for a lot of the sort of specialists we have out there. And then the large impact, large lift. Justin mentioned the UDO changes related to native trees for developments rezonings. What sort of comes along with that certified pollinator and wildlife habitat is sometimes they don't appear like organized nature. So if you want to have one in your yard, you may run into some issues with our nuisance code. Mm-hmm. So thinking about ways that we can encourage that, working with our partners in housing and neighborhoods to come up with some standards that folks are able to sort of give back on their own property and not be punished for that. And then talking about working through our own properties to really identify those sensitive or unique habitats and then ensure their protection from the get-go. So a lot of the folks in our resources and development groups do some property assessments beforehand and kind of can identify where those unique or sensitive places are. But that's something that we, can incorporate on a larger level and make part of our process if needed. And then the last one is sort of a lot of these kind of how we help citizens. So developing specific educational programming around benefits of natives. So thinking about giving away tree seedlings from our parks. You could go to a park and you could get an oak tree seedling. So thinking about ways that we can intentionally kind of talk about the benefits of natives to the public and give them some more access so as they try things on their own. So we're doing about 500 other things, and I just wanted to kind of limit that. But at that piece, I'm happy to answer questions after, but I'll turn it over to Sally to talk about what stormwater's doing.
Good afternoon. I'm Sally Hoyt with Raleigh Stormwater. So I've organized this similarly into 3 tiers: what we're doing now, what we could do, or in some cases are planning to do with current resources and authority, and then what we could do with additional resources and additional authority. So we want to thank you and your predecessors on the council for supporting green stormwater infrastructure. And that leadership that's been provided by the council has actually been a key driver in the green stormwater infrastructure program. So having that leadership and support has been great. Up on this slide is the very brief history of GSI in the city. We've been working on it for about 10 years. In 2016, there was some documents that were finalized in terms of a review of the UDO and a plan of a path forward. In 2019, council asked the Stormwater Management Advisory Commission to come up with a plan for expanding use, and in 2021, that plan was brought back to council and it was endorsed by council, and a GSI action plan was adopted, and that action plan is incorporated into the strategic plan as through a GSI goal in the strategic plan. So the GSI action plan has these 6 components. As I talk about what we've done so far, most of that has been in the lead by example category, which is really demonstrating and walking the walk on city projects. But we have done some work in all of these categories. So I'll mostly be talking about 1 and 2. Some of these have already been accomplished. Some of these, like improving the GSI maintenance program, is a forever task that will continue. So a key part of leading by example is the GSI evaluation process explicitly for city projects. So at Council's direction in 2021, we've developed that as an administrative policy. It's gone through the city's policy review process and is on the cusp of formal adoption. But we have been undertaking most of the actions encompassed in that already. So the goals for that administrative policy, or the desired outcomes, were to demonstrate the use of GSI really both for city projects and for the private development, so that they can see that these techniques work in this climate, in these, in Raleigh's climate, Raleigh's soils, that sort of thing. And also see public acceptance of those practices. Another part of that is that we want to see city projects using green stormwater infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure to meet the regulatory compliance regulations. So already some city projects have done that, but we want to up that percentage. And then GSI in general provides many benefits beyond stormwater management itself, whether it's urban heat island reduction or pollinator habitat, or there's a, Heather and I can spend all day talking about that, but basically get those auxiliary benefits. And then also to work on developing GSI champions, not just in the stormwater department, but in departments across the city. And so what that policy will look like for city CIP projects is that we have been meeting with the various CIP departments to get their upcoming CIP project lists, and then we're working with folks to evaluate potential GSI use during their conceptual design. So the policy requires evaluation. So the idea is that every project would be evaluated. Some projects might not be the right fit, or it might not work in the budget, or that sort of thing. So the last step in that evaluation process is to make a decision about whether to go forward or not go forward with the GSI. That's also the step where we would work with projects to see what support stormwater could provide from a financial standpoint if that funding is available. So some of the things we've already done that kind of go into the leading by example category is we have some great fact sheets. One of them is shown on the screen that look at how to incorporate GSI in different types of development. And actually the flip side of the fact sheet is examples of where it's been done in developments sometimes in North Carolina, sometimes elsewhere in the US. We have, in 2017, a number of text changes, UDO text changes were completed that the primary focus was to remove barriers to GSI. So things like allowing GSI in outdoor amenity areas, that it wasn't our code preventing us from doing what we wanted to do. We have had GSI design details available to the public for some time now, and we're actually working on revising those based on lessons learned and maintainability. We also are developing technical specs for city projects to use so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time and come up with best practices. We're as we update the stormwater design manual, are better incorporating GSI as an option and into the design requirements. And then we have a GSI cost tool that looks at comparison of GSI to other development strategies. And then we've, particularly in the past year, been doing a lot of staff training. So with the gardeners in the Parks Department, with project managers in a variety of departments to build people's knowledge about design, about maintenance, that sort of thing. And then, of course, we are building projects and have been doing that for some time. So we've been putting GSI in place. This is a combination of regulatory and retrofit or non-regulatory projects. Those pictures are all non-regulatory ones that have been done by the Stormwater Division. One of the projects that's currently in progress is tied to urban heat islands and incorporating GSI into areas identified as urban heat islands. And then we are already working with citizens and nonprofits and businesses to incorporate GSI through the Raleigh Rainwater Rewards, or R3 program. So in that map, you can see both the implemented projects and the places where our staff has gone out and done a consult with the property, which is, even if they don't end up implementing GSI, is a great outreach to educate folks. And currently the city is providing funding for between 75 and 100% of the cost of the project. The 100% is through some ARPA funding. So things that we have upcoming, or things that we can do with our existing resources and authority. One thing that is on the docket for early next year is to create example rezoning conditions of how projects can incorporate GSI, so that we've had some GSI related rezoning conditions in the past, and they've ranged. Some of the early ones just said, we will install a GSI device, but didn't say how big, or, you know. So in theory, they could have put in 1 square foot of permeable pavement and met the requirement. So we're working on better quantifying those and, giving folks some examples. We're going to be presenting those to SMAC early next year. Another thing that you all may or may not be aware of is there is currently in the UDO in section 865 a way for a developer to install GSI and get reimbursed by the city. That would be not to meet the regulatory requirements, it would be above and beyond. But it's been in there since 2017 and no one has used it. And I think it's a case of no one wants to be first and to potentially have their project held up in a new process. And so one of the things we want to do is identify a project that may already be partnering with the city. It might already be in a public-private partnership. There might be other reimbursements that are happening. But to figure out what is a good project that's willing to work with us and figure out that process. And then another thing we have on the horizon is GSI workshops for the design community. We've been focusing on workshops for staff. And part of that, we have been talking about how to work with designers who regularly do affordable housing projects, and especially those projects that are already subsidized by the city or incentivized. And then in terms of things that we could do with more funding or more authority, one is we think there's potential to expand the Raleigh Rainwater Rewards program if there was a bigger budget. So that would involve stormwater having a bigger budget, which would involve potentially a stormwater fee increase. The second thing, and this is something we have talked with our peers in parks, is we would love to see a dedicated city crew for GSI maintenance, and maybe that has a home in the Parks Department, but folks who have the horticultural skills to recognize native plants, that are enthused about working in that specialty area, that would, right now we are working on contracting out some of the GSI maintenance, and so the idea is that maybe in the future that could be in-house rather than contracted. And then something we have heard feedback from the development community about is a desire to be able to install GSI in the right-of-way as part of their project, but not have it be above and beyond, have it be GSI that meets their regulatory requirements. Right now, that's tricky from a from a bureaucratic standpoint of who would be responsible for the maintenance, who would, right now it would require an encroachment agreement. There's various hurdles to making that happen. But it's a potential, it's something the development community would like to see, and that could potentially increase the amount of GSI while reducing the amount of gray infrastructure used for regulatory compliance, which if they're going to spend the money on the gray infrastructure, let's have them spend it on green infrastructure is the idea there. All right, that's what I have on GSI. We also understand that you all are interested in the ongoing Raleigh mitigation feasibility study. So I'm going to give a brief overview of that. So city projects sometimes have to buy credits for nutrients as part of the stormwater rules, for wetlands or stream impacts. And the idea is there's current authority, we're not currently doing it, but there's current authority where we could build those projects locally. So build a stream restoration to offset for stream impacts. Instead of instead of buying credits and the stream restoration happens in a community outside of Raleigh. So the idea there is that it would bring the water quality impacts home into Raleigh rather than having them be elsewhere in, say, the Neuse watershed. A couple extensions to that, which we don't have the resources or authority for at this point. One thing is we currently, when it comes to nutrient reduction, we are allowed to do that. Say, a roadway project could do nutrient reduction, and that could offset another project that they're doing. What we don't currently have is the ability to trade between what are considered point and non-point sources. So say if the wastewater treatment plant needed credits, we can't go build a bioretention and have that count for providing treatment at the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plant is a point source. The roadway runoff is considered non-point source. It's not, the runoff comes off in many ways, not at one pipe. So that is something that we are interested in. And then there's also maybe opportunities to partner with Wake County and use funding that comes from a source other than the stormwater utility to do restoration projects that are potentially on Wake County properties or that sort of thing. All right, I believe that is it, and we'll hand it over to you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for your presentations. Y'all are doing a lot, so just want to say, again, thank you. I just noted some items that I want to lift up that I would like to see us continue and pursue, and I'm curious to also hear from council members on the committee any items that kind of spoke to you. I was at the tree protection ordinance workshop that NC State Extension held today in Wilson. So I just want to say that I'm having a great day when it comes to thinking about these topics. And just a shout out to our Alan Moore, urban forestry planner and parks. He gave a great presentation about what we're doing. So I've got some thoughts on that maybe after I just start with the presentation. I will say in terms of native plants, because this is something that I had asked for information about, they provide biological corridors, they provide benefits for pollinators, they're generally low maintenance in terms of less inputs needed, fertilizers, water. But I think the most important element is to prohibit invasives. So if we don't have a prohibition on invasive trees, I feel like that's just an easy thing to do. That would be something I want to lift up. I'm not sure about the minimum percentage of all required plantings. I'll say I think we might need some more conversation on that. My thought process right now is, can we increase the number of native trees that are on our list that are available in the marketplace or could be made more available? And, if we look at some of the ones that are not native, like Chinese, I think it was fringe tree, European hornbeam. I mean, there's American versions of both of those. So I'm just curious, are there opportunities to do a switch or at least to expand our list? And I realize that some of those might be slower growing, or, they may have a reason that we are not suggesting those. And maybe Zach, I don't know if you can speak to, is there a way of expanding the list without going through some kind of a text change?
Yes, that list is adjustable. So what we've run into is, I think Justin mentioned previously, you could say redbud. There's 25 different redbud cultivars. So we're not really able to list everything. That's why we kind of call it possible. But we do have the flexibility to adjust based on sort of what's available and what isn't. So the list is really more about things that have done well in the urban environment. We kind of have to provide one list for a tree that's out front, the same as in a neighborhood around Falls River, right? So trying to find a list that works in most cases and has the availability out there. But no, we can encourage and switch around. We have some concerns about the native fringe just from the emerald ash borer piece. So similar family, it's bug talk. But so yeah, to answer your question, yes, we do have flexibility and we can work on adding some more natives to the list. We've had variable success over the years.
Okay.
In those situations.
Yeah, and I do think we need to be reasonable and practical on that, because some trees, they're just not going to be great street trees for different reasons. Yep. I know edibles have been brought up to me, for example. I think some folks would like to see that, but I realize they are also a mess, so I don't know how we deal with that. I will just note a couple other items. I like the idea of drafting some template zoning conditions around native plantings. I think we've had something related to pollinator gardens, and so having something available there for private development. I'd also love to see the horticultural guidance that was described that could be created both for the city of Raleigh and for our private developers and landscapers. I think we're all aware that the workforce that is in landscaping is coming and going all the time. They don't always have the training that they need, and so the more guidance we can provide, the better. I just think about like any tree planting requirements. The way the trees are put in, the way they're watered, that first year of life is so important. And if we're not providing that guidance super clearly, then we may not be getting, a great output at the end. I also like the idea of revising nuisance standards for certified pollinator habitats, and then several of the stormwater ideas, a dedicated city crew for GSI maintenance. I know, again, that knowledge base, the experience and how you do that stuff really matters. And I've been out there and done maintenance on it before, and I'm always like, I need the expert next to me to make sure I'm taking out the right thing, putting in, the right thing, all of that. And so I think that'd be very helpful. A bigger budget for the rainwater rewards program, which is so popular. And then also that opportunity to do GSI in the right of way, to look into that, I would note. So I'll stop there. I don't know if others have ideas here. Councilmember Branch?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the information. I just have a few questions, and some of it is around, and some things for us as a council to consider. And those are probably some of the unintended consequences of requirements. Mm-hmm. And that is what I'm thinking about when it comes to affordable housing. What additional costs, like when we say we want to require certain things, what would be helpful for me is what's the minimum cost it would take to do it. So that way when we talk about these projects, because I know a project right now that it's been in limbo because of stormwater. Them trying to be able to afford to take care of their stormwater costs while still trying to do some type of affordable housing. So has there been any conversation around that, in particular around stormwater? When it comes to plants and trees, I don't think we gotten there yet. But in particular around stormwater, has there been any conversation about what policies or things we can do to make sure that when we say, hey, we want to, assist with affordable housing project, that they don't get to stormwater and we're like, the numbers don't match?
Yes, I believe I'm familiar with the project you're speaking of. So there's several factors going on at once. So one thing that we don't have control of is the state regulation. So in that case, the project mistakenly thought they would not have to meet the state regulations, but they actually did due to the size of the property. And but I think so in that case,
But that's,
it gets more to what subsidies, if we're talking about the cost of stormwater or of other infrastructure requirements being a barrier to affordable housing, then I think the city needs to think about how do we subsidize affordable housing. So if we require a development to provide stormwater management, to provide sidewalks, to do roadway improvements, to extend a sewer line, how do we address those things? I think the other thing, we have done some brainstorming around affordable housing and thought about, how can we better assist within the regulatory framework? And we are certainly open to, whether that's providing our time and technical resources, technical expertise in terms of, meeting with people more frequently or that sort of thing. One of the things we want to help educate folks about in thinking about the long-term picture for both affordable housing and market rate housing is that typically green stormwater infrastructure is a surface practice, and we're seeing many projects turn to underground stormwater controls, which meet the land price pressure and allows them to get more yield, but underground practices typically have a much higher long-term maintenance cost than a surface practice. And so I think thinking about that long-term life cycle is, if we can help make designers, give them technical knowledge, make them more comfortable designing those practices, I think the other thing that may have helped in the site you mentioned is being able to do stormwater in the right-of-way, because that would have provided some additional space, as they were trying to balance the number of units. Does that address your question?
No, that's good, and you give me a great segue for me to look down this way. Maybe that's a good core team initiative to look at all of our requirements that's in our code when we talk about sidewalks, connectivity, trees, stormwater, utilities. When we're talking about affordable housing, what are those impacts? Because the impacts that they were 10 years ago are not the same now, because our code keeps changing. Technology does change in some things, but maybe it'd be good to get a core team together within the city, bringing in housing in neighborhoods, bringing in planning, bring in, parks with trees and stormwater to really look at, okay, so when we're saying we're incentivizing and we're trying to help with affordable housing, is there something other than the dollar sign that we can look at or we can do, looking at new tools? Because a lot of projects, I have another project, include transportation, because I have another project that is having some transportation issues because they're supposed to widen the road, but there's a big topo issue. So, what can we do to really make sure that when we're trying to incentivize that we're looking at this holistically and not sometimes, in a vacuum. So that's kind of my charge. So, because I name a lot of departments that don't fall under you, that maybe we can kind of something to think about when y'all are planning for the new year. And luckily I have 3 good directors in here that hear me as well.
So, yeah, certainly. I think we could go back and I think understanding a bit more what the objectives are. I think what you might be talking about is adding an initiative to the strategic plan. The council will talk about your strategic plan at your retreat, and you always have the opportunity to identify new objectives there and certainly trying to understand, are there regulations that have a disparate impact on affordable housing, or are some of our support programs sufficiently addressing cost drivers from regulatory projects? I think certainly could be captured in a strategic plan initiative, and by nature of that being added to your strategic plan, there would be a cross-departmental team that would be assigned to work on that initiative. So
Perfect.
certainly we could work with you that has typically been kind of an iterative process, and so appreciate the flag, and that might be something that we could raise more deeply through some of your conversation about the strategic plan, about what that might look like to articulate some of those policy objectives.
Perfect, thank you. And I only have two other things. One is you mentioned we go out and help homeowners identify issues, identification of sensitive or unique habitats around the home. Can you, I want to make sure I heard that right.
No, that was specific to city-owned and controlled property.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
But a lot of that kind of revolves into educational pieces, similarly to how to identify a native plant or how to identify an invasive. So not specific to an individual homeowner, but more broadly as an educational piece.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is back on stormwater. It was about the reimbursement for GIS. I guess one thing I heard was that's going above what's regulatory and requirement. Can we still, someone get some more information on that program? And if it's not being used, then there's a problem. So hopefully we can find a way to resolve that. And it may be something I saw was allowing, I guess, GIS to be used to meet regulatory requirements. Okay.
Yes. So the first part, the part that's already allowed but that hasn't been used, we actually did about a year ago. We did some interviews with staff and with some designers about what was working and not working from the previous work we had done on GSI, and that was something that the designers all brought up. And basically, they said one of the designers had started to use that process, and then they were afraid it was going to cause delays in their project, and so they did not pursue it. Okay. And so that's why we want to identify a pilot project that maybe is already a project that is partnering with the city on things. We also have some work to do internally on establishing a reimbursement schedule. That's something that Raleigh Water has when it comes to water and sewer lines, but it's less, the GSI is less standardized than water pipe. So it'll be a heavier lift to come up with that reimbursement table, but that's one way that we can help get it to be it really was a time issue. Gotcha. Was the feedback that we got.
And if we wanted to allow private regulatory of GIS in right of way, is that a policy change, or do you need 5 people to say do it? Like, what does that look like?
Yes, I think that would need to be reflected in some of our regulations, including the street manual. I think that some other, I think ultimately if that's, when you conclude your conversation, we can help ultimately craft the authorization for staff to begin work on some of these items that would require changes to regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Patton?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate you being here. Couple things that I'll put my exclamation mark on. The prohibition of invasive species feels like you're telling us it's low-hanging fruit. Feels right there. Pro that. I did have a question about prohibition of sales of invasives. Like if so my neighbor can't buy a mimosa tree when she goes to the nursery. Is that an available, is that a legal tool that we have access to?
So I think we'd have to do some more research. I'm going to defer to David. I think we have very limited authority to regulate business activities.
Yeah, I can look into it if you want, but my initial reaction is that we would probably not have the authority to regulate that.
Got it. Such a common.
Councilmember, can I take that just a half step further as Pat Young with Planning and Development? Currently, we don't have any authority to regulate non-development related tree planting on private property. So all of our authority is when there's a development permit required, like a site plan or a building permit. Through this authority that Justin referred to, the rezoning, the what's it called again? Resource management, conservation, zoning. There is some ability to manage that if it's done through the zoning process. So I just wanted to make sure that there was clarity that independent of the retail sellers of these, we also don't have anything in place currently to manage it for private property unless it's associated with redevelopment or development.
So 3 years after they build it, they can put it in.
Got it.
Right.
And if we pursue that resource management district and it was put on, my house, then I would, like, help me understand how would I make sure I didn't violate the thing, or how would you make sure I didn't
Yeah,
violate it?
my understanding of that authority, which is very broad, and only us in Asheville have that authority in North Carolina, is that you can't apply non-development regulations around trees. We would have to have a long conversation with you all about the administrative approach to that. We would certainly need significant staff to essentially police and monitor and manage that, because I would anticipate constant complaints from neighbors about they planted this, they cut down this, they did this. And right now we just say we don't regulate that.
Got it. Okay.
And I do think that was the intent of the earlier slide that talked about effective regulations, and something that is difficult to understand that you are responsible for, or to understand what it is you're responsible for, are typically difficult for compliance, and they're difficult for us and from an enforcement perspective. And so I do think if a future conversation happened about resource management zones or any other regulation, thinking through those elements is very helpful.
Okay, cool, thanks. Also want to put my exclamation mark on draft zoning conditions for both stormwater and invasives or native planting. I like that. Does stormwater get any money from the general fund, or is it only enterprise funds? Only enterprise funds, okay. And then in the program that you talked about, the reimbursement for the going above and beyond GSI, how much, I assume even though it hasn't been utilized, there is budgeted funds for it under the assumption that it could be utilized. How much is there? And follow-up question, like, what are the characteristics of a good pilot project if you're looking for one?
Yeah, Wayne Miles, Stormwater Manager, Engineering Services. So 2 parts to the question there. I think one was related to the Rainwater Rewards Program, right, where there's the reimbursement, or were you referring to the reimbursement through the UDO?
That one, the UDO.
Okay, so through the UDO, that would be funded through the stormwater utility, and that would be available through, for example, our line item where we provide green stormwater infrastructure on city projects or city properties. So this would be an area typically where we'd identify as a priority for green stormwater infrastructure, and there was a development that was going in there, so we would see that there would be a mutual benefit to installing green stormwater infrastructure, and we would use that as an opportunity then as part of that development for the developer to install the green stormwater infrastructure to our design standards, and then we would come to an agreement, as Sally mentioned, for an amount that would be reimbursed for the cost of installing that green stormwater infrastructure. And it hasn't been used because GSI, as Alex explained, that reimbursement program has standardized reimbursement amounts. For water and sewer pipe, it's kind of easy to say we'll reimburse you X dollars for a foot of this size pipe. We have not yet established the standards by which that reimbursement would be done for green stormwater infrastructure. We would have to come up with the templates and the basis for that reimbursement amount. So that's part of the what we need to do in order to get that program going, and why a pilot would be very helpful to develop those standards.
Okay. And what would the characteristics be of a good pilot? I'm sorry if you folded it into the answer and I didn't catch it.
It would be an area that we think would be beneficial to have GSI. We would want to develop standards in terms of the square footage of GSI and the performance standards that we would want met for that, and really, an area where they would provide the other benefits as well, whether it be an urban heat island benefit or some other social aesthetic benefit from GSI as well.
Okay.
And a willing developer who would be willing to be first, because as we're working through this, it could take a little extra time. And I think that, as Sally mentioned, has been one of the hesitancies. Developers' time is money. So working through this the first time could take a little bit more time.
Sure. Okay. I guess I'm just trying to, think about rooms I might be in that you might not be in, and like when would be the moment when I'd be like, you should talk to my friend Sally. It really sounds like you might be the right candidate for this thing. So I guess I'm trying to figure out like what I might take with me to trigger that.
If I might, Councilmember Pat Young again with Planning and Development. Not a stormwater expert, but I have been involved in this long enough, and Sally and Wayne can comment. GSI is great. It has tremendous benefits that you've heard from our stormwater colleagues. One thing about it is that it does unquestionably, in almost every application, require a lot more maintenance and a lot more labor rather than equipment. And I think often developers are concerned about taking that on. So the extent to which we can share that burden through allowing the use of our right-of-way, for example, is a huge way to move the ball on that. So it's just kind of an observation that I wanted to share with you all. I think that a lot of the hesitancy when I talk to developers, they're like, great idea, I love it, but I really don't want to push that burden onto, it might be something that complicates financing for the end user because of the uncertainty about the technology and about the labor and frequency of maintenance. So
I think I'm set for now.
Okay. I just want to pull out a few more items that didn't come up in this presentation. I was curious to hear about construction safeguards. So I know that Durham has some extra safeguards in place based on their soil types, so different kinds of fencing, those kinds of regulations. I'm just going to go through my list real quick, and then I think Wayne might have some answers on that one. I'm also curious how we address parking lots. Do we have any regulations when it comes to tree requirements and parking lots for shade, stormwater retention? And I'm just thinking about different ways that we do that, like avoiding islands for tree health, making sure there's enough soil volume, parking stalls with porous pavers. That's just something I'm curious about. We have been talking a little bit, I know Pat's team is thinking about tree retention and replacement requirements in our smaller lots, less than 2 acres around the city. So I'm still thinking about that. And then I'm also curious, do we have enough compliance officers overall? I think you all mentioned we have 5 across the city. And is that for everything? I'm just curious, do we need more of those folks? Because when, at least my understanding around reviewing and enforcing our tree protection ordinances as is, that we only do that if someone sees something that they're concerned about, in response to a complaint. And I don't know that we're, can be proactive with our current capacity. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, hi, Wayne Miles, Stormwater Program Manager. So a couple of questions there. I do want to clarify first in terms of compliance in development inspectors. In stormwater, we have 8. That is separate from the compliance team that I think you referenced under Justin Rometta. But we do have 8 inspectors that confirm all compliance with stormwater regulations. Much of that is soil and erosion control compliance, especially during wet seasons. You mentioned Durham County's program. We did catch wind of that question, and so Lauren Witherspoon, our development inspection supervisor, reached out to Durham County and spoke about some of the differences. They did in May of this year impose a second line of silt fence as a requirement in wetlands and buffer areas, so that was new to their program. Right now, we require a single silt fence. However, if that is inadequate in terms of its performance, we can go back and require additional silt fence or other measures to be put in place. But that was one recent change that Durham County has made. Another recent change that Durham County has made is in areas that have a Triassic soil, which is a particularly very fine clay soil that is very hard to remove, which we only have a little bit of that up near the Briar Creek area in Raleigh, but Durham has a lot more prevalence of that. They do have additional requirements. In some cases, flocculants are required. So it's a chemical addition that helps promote flocculation of soils, small parts sticking together and settle out easier. That's not something we require at this point in time. That's I think it is somewhat of an unproven technology. It's been primarily used in water treatment plants up to this point, so I think that's still a work in progress. It is much more costly. And as I said, we only have a very small portion of our jurisdiction that has that type of soil, but it's something we can keep an eye on and consider if that's something that Durham County finds beneficial and successful.
Thanks, Wayne.
Great, thank you.
I think Justin Rometta can address the zoning questions.
Yeah, so apologies if it wasn't clear earlier. There are 6 zoning code enforcement officers, and so they're charged with the entire city, but only specific Parks has inspectors for certain things as well. With regard to the parking lot landscaping, we do have requirements for trees in parking spaces generally. Can kind of sum those up as 1 shade tree per every 2,000 square feet of parking area. There are island requirements that apply basically every 10 spaces. There's a required island that does need to have a shade tree in it.
Has there been any thought around avoiding islands and having like larger areas so that the trees can be happier and healthier?
We did make some adjustments a few years ago in terms of allowing GSI practices in those islands and those sorts of things, but we hadn't gone any further than that, or haven't been any recent discussions about any changes of that nature.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious if there could be groupings versus, the single everywhere.
Yeah, we can certainly look into that.
Okay, thanks. Other comments? Councilmember Patton?
Yeah, always. Wayne, I'm sorry. Can you give us an update on the stormwater design manual updates? What's the timeline? I know you've... Okay.
That would be my project, so
Perfect.
that's why Wayne has
Glad to hear.
pointed to me. So we are currently addressing the public comments that were received when it was put out for informal public review. And we will be presenting the proposed changes based on those comments to the Stormwater Management Advisory Commission at their meeting next Thursday. Our plan is to come bring a request for a text change to the council meeting. I believe it's the first week of January. And we are prepared to take that to the Planning Commission text change committee as soon as their January meeting.
Got it. Thank you.
So it has to come to council and then go to planning? So we will have to authorize? Is that a process?
Yes, so manuals are, because they're implementing the Unified Development Ordinance, the city's practice has been to treat those manuals with the same weight and with the same processes that you do changes to the UDO. So that manual will go through a similar process as any UDO text change would.
So just for my council members, because I know we all kind of want this, what's the time sensitivity of it? The reason I'm asking, because I expect that January 2nd meeting to be a lot of items, and I didn't know if it could come the second meeting in January, or would that throw you all off?
So we will certainly look at the agenda and balancing. Again, you wouldn't substantively be taking action. You would just be authorizing that to begin the process. But we will certainly, as we often do, look at the agenda in its totality and determine whether or not that needs to come forward on that time frame.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, because I know based on the agenda to be kind of near towards somewhat of the end, and I want to make sure council members are alert enough to give it the attention we need to.
Before we summarize, I just want to make sure, Councilmember Black, do you have anything you want to add to the discussion?
The beauty of going last is that everybody kind of says everything you're going to say. So just wanted to say I agree with a lot of the things that I heard from the stormwater people about needing more capacity there. One of the things that I thought would be interesting with the native plants was looking to see if we have any indigenous or local groups that we can work with to bring in expertise from that level with looking at native plants and what can happen in the city. Additionally, and we didn't talk about this, and I don't know if it fits in, but I'm really curious about green roofs and the role of that in helping with our urban heat islands, specifically downtown, and if that is something that we see in the future as a possibility of working with developers to implement. I know it's something that's kind of not familiar for a lot of people down here, but it would be something that I would be interested in, or living walls, something that adds more green landscape through development for mitigating one, carbon, and two, heat.
So I don't know, ultimately, certainly planning and development could speak to that from a building code perspective. I don't know if the question is whether those could meet some of somebody's stormwater obligations or just whether they're permitted or how we encourage them. Is it all of those? Okay.
I'll start, turn it over to Wayne, Pat Young with Planning and Development. They are allowable. There are a number of enhancements and considerations that need to be done to reinforce roofs. They're very costly. They have tremendous benefits, as you framed correctly, but we don't see a lot of uptake really primarily because of cost and maintenance. But I'll let Wayne talk about how maybe those are incentivized in other ways.
Yeah, agreed. We have not seen a lot, although we have used some on city projects. Raleigh Union Station is probably the best example. If you go to look at Raleigh Union Station, it has a green roof. Stormwater has been involved in the East Civic Tower design, and there is a plan. We are subsidizing some additional stormwater above and beyond regulatory requirements. Some of the green roof usage on the terrace, as well as some other stormwater detention in the tree boxes, suspended pavement, and the sidewalk. But green roofs are definitely allowed. As Pat Young said, they are more expensive. They require additional structural design oftentimes. And in North Carolina, they can be a climate challenge because a green roof, it has to sustain a very wide variety of drought and wet conditions. So you often have to have irrigation on them. So if we do have very dry periods, you have to have irrigation to keep the plants alive in order for them to sustain their purpose, really. But certainly it's something that we use and we encourage.
So Wayne, I think part of the question was whether or not that can meet somebody's a GSI or on-site stormwater obligation.
I'll turn that over to Sally, our regulatory expert here.
Thank you. Yes, the green roofs are considered part of the green stormwater infrastructure toolbox, and they're actually explicitly in the state stormwater manual as an allowed practice. And so use of a green roof can be used to help meet stormwater requirements.
Well, with that, I'm curious, Tansy, do you feel like you have a summary of what we're asking for next?
I do. I think between us, will have a lot of notes. So I think there are a couple of options that are available to the committee. We could certainly come back with some of these items that came up. We'll have another process, either in terms of budget direction or operational guidance in terms of goal setting or strategic plan. Others are regulatory pieces. One option, you could hold this in committee. We could come back with a specific report that gives you feedback about the next steps that you could direct, or the appropriate processes to address some of the items that came up. So we could bring that back to a future GNR committee, and you could consider that. You could also report this out and ask for that report to be brought to the full council for consideration. So
That's what I would recommend, because we're not going to meet till the end of January. We have, I think, several things that are going to come up. So if we can report this out and just get that summary at our next council meeting, that would be my proposal.
Well, probably January council meeting, because the next one's next week.
You're right. Yeah, so let's have that report out at the beginning of January, if that works for you.
Yeah, I think we can accomplish that.
So is that the motion to
That's the motion.
second?
All in favor? Oh, all right, that's unanimous. I think with that, then, we can close the meeting. Good to see you all, and have a good Tuesday.